world. It is Friday. It is Friday, June 2nd, 2023.
I'm Michael Agello.
Stop it. Just stop it.
I'm Jan Levine, and I'm happy that Eck at least got the year right.
I'm Kevin Allen.
And I'm Eklund. And you're watching HockeyBuzzcast on HockeyBuzz.com. We are one day away from the greatest show on ice, the Stanley Cup Final, which is coming on tomorrow. And and this is like one of the more interesting series ever. We talked a little bit about it before. We'll talk more about it today. Today's media day. I've got some really interesting little tidbits about the Panthers. But Kevin, you got something to start with, which I think.
Well, I wanted to start with one of my favorite Stanley Cup traditions. Is there's a Swedish writer. He's covered the NHL, Per German. It's Bjurman. He's from Aftonblatt, and he lives in the U.S. I believe he lives in New York. But when I was president of the Writers Association, I got to know him because he applied for membership, and it was kind of a new thing that we were allowing foreign press in. But he's based here. And there's Gunnar Nordstrom also writes for Express, and he lives in L.A. as well. So there's a couple of them. But anyway, the tradition is that what Per's been doing, and I verified this today because I actually wrote a story about this list. 15 years ago, he started, and a lot of people do predictions. They gather predictions from people about things, and they write 10 or 12. Well, Per takes it the extra mile. For 15 years, he's rounded up always more than 200. Now, these are people within the hockey world, mostly Swedes, because he's obviously from Sweden. But, it's the who's who. I mean, he gets Peter Forsberg. He gets Nicholas Lidstrom. He gets Daniel Alfredsson. He gets Alvin, the general manager of the Canucks. He just gets Håkan Andersson from the scout of the Red Wings. I mean, it's just a who's who, and then he gets the journalists as well. Well, when I was reading these predictions, because I love reading them, was the fact that what struck me is that everybody in the world has played for the Florida Panthers at one time or another, because all of their predictions was, always included, I loved my time when I was with the Panthers. I'm rooting for them, or I always wondered when I was there whether they were ever going to win. I mean, it's just kind of a fun, kind of thing and that's what struck me is how many people have played for the Panthers. It just seems like that's the place you go in the NHL for 1 or 2 years, while you're trying to figure out where you really want to go.
Everyone else goes to Florida to retire. It's like the hockey people do it too.
Yeah. And so anyway, because of that most of them were taking the Panthers. So
most of them were taking the Panthers.
And Vegas has only been in existence for 6 years, so that severely cuts down the pool of ex-Golden Knights that they'd be picking them purely on the fact that they think they're the better team. And we already made our predictions.
Jan, we didn't hear yours.
Jan, what's your prediction for the series, for the Stanley Cup Final?
It's interesting. So I've been going back and forth because clearly there's arguments to be made for both teams, right? You have the rest versus rust also type of thing, where we got into the NBA yesterday, and clearly the Nuggets kind of disproved that theory for game one, especially the way they came out of the gate. So I'm actually taking Florida. I'm taking Florida in 6, and largely, honestly, it's the Matthew Tkachuk impact, right? I think that Tkachuk has just changed. I hate to say the culture, but just the manner in which, you have a superstar. And we know that Alexander Barkov is, right? But Barkov is way more behind the scenes. Tkachuk has no problem being front and center, and clearly he's got the genes because of his dad, because of Keith in terms of the personality. And he's kind of brought that to Florida, which is something they somewhat lacked in the past, and part of the reason why they went out and got him. And then you add in Bobrovsky, right? And if you think about it, Bobrovsky, to a certain extent, is playing for legacy, right? If he gets the Stanley Cup, a lot of the conversation has been does the 2 Vezinas and the Stanley Cup and some of the other honors and the numbers he's going to produce, is that going to be sufficient to get him into the Hall down the road, despite the bobbles he's had in his career, right? And if he gets that Cup win, that clearly may push him over the edge down the road when it comes to Hall voting down the road.
Well, Jan, I almost think it washes away because, I mean, if we did a show last summer, and I think we may have, of what was the worst contracts in the NHL, his would have been one of them. And that sort of, the $10 million a year that you're spending on him, all of a sudden that gets washed away if he wins a Conn Smythe Trophy and they win a Stanley Cup. So
you would have had this argument 2 months ago. And you would have had the same thing because Alex Leon was their number one there for a while until Bobrovsky kind of stepped in between the pipes and has helped carry the team moving forward. And look, his save against Brad Marchand right now in Game 5 is the moment of the playoffs, if you think about it.
Yeah.
And it really hits home. Like, and I talk about this a lot because it's one of my pet peeves. I really do not like blanket statements of like this guy can't win because he hasn't done it. And because they, what I always say is, until they do it. And, he just is another name added to the list of, this is a guy that can't perform in the postseason. And
if he wins this, Kevin, is he in the Hall of Fame? I mean, it's possible. I think
it's possible. I don't think it's a slam dunk, but
no.
I mean, 2 Vezina trophies.
Yeah, that's going to be the key, by the way.
Right.
And the Cup championship to go on top of that, and the volume in terms of wins, depending on how you discount the number of wins somebody gets. But that augments the case associated with the 2 Vezinas in the Cup championship potential.
And I mean, one of the greatest upsets in recent history, where he leads Columbus to a 4-game sweep over the President's Trophy winning Tampa, and they didn't go to the Stanley Cup Final, but that can't be minimized. So,
right.
Who's done more on less impressive teams. I mean, that's the thing. That's the crazy thing about it. He's Columbus and Florida the entire time. I mean, Philadelphia for a brief period of time in the beginning, but that really wasn't really anything. But he got his 2 Vezinas with Columbus and Florida, and it's two Vezinas.
They're both Columbus.
Both with Columbus, but perhaps the Stanley Cup with Florida. No. I mean, those 2 Columbus teams weren't gang beaters,
but they were sound defensive clubs under John Tortorella, so they sort of fed into the goaltender being the centerpiece. They were good teams, but he was better players on that team. So I think you can make a case, and again, we'll talk about this in the summer. There's a long list of goaltenders that I think aren't in that should be in, like Curtis Joseph, like Tom Barrasso. Maybe you could make a case for Mike Vernon or Chris Osgood because they won 2 Stanley Cups. But, I think Bobrovsky immediately goes into that group.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting to me about that is I think the 2 Vezinas mean more to his candidacy than the Stanley Cup. There are a lot of goalies that have won a Stanley Cup that aren't going to get any consideration. But when you have those 2 Vezinas to go with it, and I don't know, I have to look it up. Has he done anything internationally?
No, Russia didn't win anything when he was.
Well, even if they didn't win, did they medal or did he get a?
I'll look.
I remember the funny thing, not the funny thing about him, but they always went to Varlamov over him in Russia.
For sure.
And yet when Bob came in those some of those series, he did play pretty well for Russia. And there was a lot of debate whether they should have started him. I forget whether it was the 2010 Olympics or it wouldn't have been that Olympics.
He won a bronze medal at the World Junior in 2008. He split time with Varlamov in Sochi. Won the World Championships. So nothing of major consequence.
I think it was Sochi where they went to him late and they stayed with Varlamov way too long. I think if I remember right, Russia did, and that was
they didn't medal in Sochi, right?
Right, and that was a big debate.
They got the Americans beat them.
Yeah. Right.
That was
it was a TJ Oshie game.
Right.
Yeah, that was a TJ Oshie game. You're right. Yeah.
What I think also augments his case, though, is Mike, you talked about obviously Columbus beating the President's Trophy winners. Well, you have the same thing potentially this year where Florida, as the 8 seed, got past 3 of the top 5 teams in the league, including the number 1 overall team during the regular season, which bolsters his case, even though he wasn't necessarily between the pipes when the round started.
Yeah, but those are the kind of issues that still sitting on the U.S. Hockey Hall of Fame committee and having previously been on the Hockey Hall of Fame committee. I can tell you just that fact that Jan just mentioned, those play out big because when you're arguing jewelry, everybody's got jewelry. They've got all these, Vezinas and all. Because if you don't, you don't even get nominated. So you got to have all that. Well, then it becomes, what else have you got? And, when you're able to rattle that off, that Florida took down those teams, that causes everyone to go,
Well, and I know, Kev, it's been well established, and I've always sort of carried this torch because he started his career in Buffalo. But okay, not only did Barrasso win 2 Stanley Cups, he won a Calder and a Vezina in his rookie year as an 18-year-old.
Yeah.
I mean, I know the personality issues, but at some point, like Jim Rice got in the Hall of Fame, and he was a jerk to Boston reporters. Right. You'd think that after 20 some odd years, they would overlook that because Barrasso did have not the best goaltending career, but a very good goaltending career.
Well, what's interesting about that is, the relationship that Barrasso had with reporters has no bearing on his Hall of Fame because they don't vote on it. But it's his general overall grumpiness, I think, has, became kind of a factor that people do talk about. Like, I think around the hockey world, outside the media, because the media doesn't vote on, obviously, and it's an 18-person committee.
Correct.
And, it's former executives, and I think there are 2 members of the media, but mostly it's, coaches and general managers and people who've been around the game for a long time. But I think it is well established that, he did have kind of a cantankerous personality. And there's nobody probably that's been in that, committee room who has said, that Tom Barrasso is a really nice guy, because again, having been in those meetings, that stuff comes up.
Yeah.
As you're splitting hairs, when everybody looks great, everybody that comes before you looks like the greatest player in the history of the world. You start talking about, was he a good team guy?
Was he that bad, Kevin? Like, really?
So
was he that bad? Or was it like the sentence, like we always joke about, every player has a sentence put on them. Barrasso's a bad guy.
Ty Cobb was a murderer, but he was a hell of a base stealer.
Right, but I mean, I never dealt with him. Was he that bad?
He was tough on reporters, but I could not say what the guys in the locker room. I know some guys in the locker room didn't like him. I mean, I remember talking to people about they would shake their head about Barrasso, but personally, I don't think it should matter.
Right.
That's how I feel about it. But it does color your thinking. I mean. It just gets in the way. So
this question in the chat room, which I think we should ask a second. So Christopher Patton said, "Is this the same Kevin Allen who was a writer's credit on Without Fear? I picked it up at Goodwill and have been enjoying it a lot."
It is the same Kevin Allen.
He did with Bob Duff about goaltending, right?
Yeah, Bob and Duff and I wrote it. We ranked the goalies. At the time we said it was the first time goalies had ever been ranked. So
there you go.
In that way. So Barrasso did do all that. The other thing he has against him is his numbers are never great. But it's the wrong year to have great numbers. That's
Rampere's numbers weren't great.
It has to be adjusted for error.
The other thing, going back to Bobrovsky, because we should talk about this point too. I think if he got the Conn Smythe Trophy, now all of a sudden, you're 2 Vezinas. If they win it, then he got the Conn Smythe. We all say in Detroit that had Osgood won the Conn Smythe,
right,
and ended up and won that, he would be in the Hall of Fame because the jewelry would be overwhelming.
Well, he's as good a Conn Smythe candidate as anybody, right? And the reality is, him and Kachuk, if they were Florida to win this, it's a toss-up in my mind.
It could be a split. Has there ever been a split for a vote?
Don't you think though? I mean,
no, I don't think so, Mike. I don't think they've ever had shared.
No, they haven't. But I mean, it's hard for me to say this, but right now, if I had to vote, I'd vote for Kachuk. I mean, he's got he's been in on 42% of their goals.
Yeah,
that's Mario Lemieux-esque. That's Wayne Gretzky-esque, and he's just been a physical force and clearly the flag carrier for the Charge.
Yeah.
So I'd have they both been just unbelievable. So
And here's the thing. I think, Kevin, if they win the Stanley Cup, it'll probably be because of Bobrovsky. Like, because this series, I think, will come down to that. Like, I think this series, it might be Tkachuk again, but I think that to stop Vegas and win this cup, it'll have to be a couple games that Bobrovsky just stands on his head, I think.
Yeah.
Do you think there's any chance that if Florida loses, Bobrovsky wins the Conn Smythe?
No,
I don't think so.
I don't think so either. But I'm kicking myself because we talked about this on a previous show about it was four players and Reggie Leach was the only skater. It was all goal. I forgot about Glenn Hall in '68. He won the Conn Smythe when St. Louis lost to Montreal. So it's five players who were on losing teams that won the Conn Smythe.
Hextall did it right against the Oilers.
Against Edmonton.
Yeah. Jaguar, right?
Jaguar against the Devils, Roger Crozier against the Montreal Canadiens, I think 65. So yeah, I mean it's all goalies except Reggie Leach.
It's kind of interesting. I mean, who does Vegas have that's really been is it Eichel?
Eichel. It's Eichel.
It's Eichel every.
I mean,
way, right?
Marchessault's also had, I think, a pretty good series overall.
Too, yeah. Yeah,
he's got a little revenge factor now, also Marchessault.
And on defense, I think Pietrangelo has been the guy that they expected, but he hasn't put up a bunch of points. So the guy who leads the team in scoring usually has the advantage over that rock solid defender. Let me segue here, because we were talking about Tkachuk, and when Brad Treliving held his media availability yesterday in Toronto. He mentioned Tkachuk.
Right.
He mentioned basically, and you would think, okay, the guy forced his way out of Calgary and there was probably some acrimony there. In fact, it was the exact opposite. Tkachuk texted him and congratulated him on getting the GM job in Toronto, thought he would do a great job. Yeah. And Treliving referred to Tkachuk essentially as his son. He says that, they had a phenomenal relationship. He went to him last year and says, I've just got to let you know, I'm not going to sign here in Calgary. So if here's the places I want to go, work on that. Right. And it ended up being a positive deal for Calgary because they got something for a guy who was going to walk away in a year, Kev. And Kev, I just said, Brad Treliving referred to Matthew Tkachuk as almost like his son, because there was that kind of good relationship there and rapport. He drafted him in that famous, I think, 2016 draft. And, he had a fantastic relation with him. And Tkachuk congratulated him on the job with the Leafs. And for Toronto, obviously that was my focus. That's a good sign in terms of Treliving's relations with the players that he's got to sign over the next couple years. And the relationships that he has with those players. So I was impressed by Treliving in that media availability, but it's a media availability. Ryan Leaf had a good press conference before he started as a quarterback with the San Diego Chargers, and then he stunk on the field.
But let's no one doesn't like Brad Treliving. Like, he's a great guy. Like, he's a top guy. Like, he's well liked, well respected, well liked. He's just a good guy. Like, there's no two ways about it. Like, I've never heard a bad word said about him.
Yep.
Ever. And he's just right, among the top guys out there. Dubas, on the other hand, I have heard bad words about, but I like Kyle Dubas, but
let me just add this, because we're sitting at the Scotiabank Arena about a half hour before the Treliving presser, and that's when it breaks that Kyle Dubas is being named president of hockey operations with the Penguins, and immediately through the room, it's like this is a WWE troll job, like stepping on a press conference a half hour before. Now, Brendan Shanahan deflected it and said he had been in contact with the Penguins and they, needed to get it out there before today, which was media day at the Stanley Cup, and that it was planned. Elliot Friedman said it was planned to be released in the afternoon after the Leafs did it, but it was going to get out. Some of the Pittsburgh reporters had gotten it, and they needed to move it up, and that's the reason why. Now, I don't know. I mean, I know Kyle Dubas, just in passing. I don't think he would do that. I think it was just a coincidence. But
the Penguins aren't the kind of organization that would do that either. Like, Penguins don't care about the Maple Leafs.
Plus, who cares?
Exactly.
Right.
I mean, seriously, like what? why is this even a story? Who
It
cares?
was different if it was like the Ottawa Senators naming him or something like that, but the Penguins just don't care about the Maple Leafs.
I thought it was ridiculous when I read, they planned it so that the Toronto writers couldn't get there. Like, how many Toronto writers would go to that? I mean,
Well,
an interesting discussion with somebody about Dubas for a second. I think is interesting to note. And this is so. I'm a little shocked, a little surprised, that he's president of Hockey Ops and not GM, right? Like we all talked about that. Like we talked about, okay, so basically, but he is going to be the GM until after free agency. So I guess he's the GM.
I can tell you why.
I can too, because he said.
He said why, and but what is interesting to me is the position of Hockey Ops is kind of like the new GM in the NHL. Like, and I talked to somebody else about this. It's like, it's like the new black. Like it's like. It is the new GM, like, so president of Hockey Ops is where it's at now because it's like the GM without the pressure of the GM.
It's the new structure. But it's not original because Montreal did it with Jeff Gorton as the president of Hockey Ops, and Kent Hughes, who was an agent, as the GM, and same thing with Vancouver with Jim Rutherford as president and Patrick Alvin as the GM.
Right, working for Astro Living.
Yeah, he was a first time.
I said that too, and I think
that's true. But the reason here is this, and like Kevin said, Dubas was upfront about it. He's going to do the job as an interim until the end of June, and what he didn't say.
July.
He's at
the end of June.
After July. I watching it very carefully.
Contracts run out at the end of June, and then the person he probably is targeting, which some people think is Jason Spezza, some people think it's Brandon Pridham. There's other people in the Leafs organization that their contracts may expire after that. I've heard Ryan Hardy and Wes Clark, all these people who Dubas brought into the Leaf organization. Their contracts run out on June 30th, and then they would be able to sign them. Now, Pridham is the name that's been mentioned most, and the report is he's got 2 years left in his contract, but where the title is important is the fact that he's an AGM in Toronto, and if Pittsburgh offers him GM, in some of these contracts there's an out there where if somebody
I asked somebody about this specifically, Mike, and you're right. Like this, I always thought that no one would stop you from moving up, right? But the reality is it has a lot to do with the contract you sign with a team because in a contract, I talked to one GM who said, I'm allowed to talk to anybody, or they have to give permission to talk to somebody because it's in my contract that they have to give permission. Where he says in other cases, it's not in the contract that they have to give permission. So that is not necessarily a given, even though it is kind of like the norm and accepted thing that no one will stop someone from moving up in a position. It's not. We saw like Dubas, they stopped Dubas from talking to somebody to move up. Remember? Way back.
Colorado.
Yeah, so I mean, it can be done, but the reality is like but because Dubas in his contract didn't have that if a higher position is offered to me, you have to let me go for it. Like that is something that GMs and assistant GMs and all that negotiate in their contracts, which I didn't realize until yesterday, but that is actually the case.
But if I had to bet money, I would say that I'd say the odds are about 90-10 that whoever the GM is coming from the Leafs organization. He brought in all those people. I think one of them will be his choice.
Let's talk for a second about Jason Spezza as a GM. Like I am a huge Jason. I would consider him one of my bigger friends in hockey. I actually like Jason Spezza. I know him. I talk to him. It's just a strange. I mean, he's definitely assistant GM type.
I don't think
that's why this whole thing feels very much more like.
I don't think he's a leading candidate. I think his name is being mentioned because he resigned with Dubas, but he served 1 year as a special assistant to the GM. He really doesn't have the experience to step into a general. I mean, is this Garth Snow all over again? Because that's what. Because
to me, it's just like it's Dubas is the GM, but not calling him the GM. That's what it is.
Right.
Like and he's an assistant GM. Like right, Kevin? Am I wrong about that?
Yeah. No, that's right.
I mean, that seems like what we're talking about here, which means that people who are GMs now, they need to become.
Yeah, I mean, although is this really much different than if this happened? I don't think it will. I'm with Mike on this. But if it happened, is this much different than Danny Briere? I mean, Danny Briere. So I mean, I
say the same thing. No, I agree. Although Danny did GM for a while in the NHL, he has a little more experience than Spezza. But not a lot. Not
enough. Not enough to be.
Not enough. Agreed. And I'm 100% behind that too. Like I agree with that.
Yeah.
And the one difference though is, I mean, okay, if say for example, Spezza is named the general manager, you have a GM. He has a 2-year contract. 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 He has a that's got 5 years of experience in the league in Dubas as part of the mix. So he has support. It's not like Briere, where Briere really is. I mean, Keith Jones is a neophyte when it comes to management in the league, and he really doesn't have experienced guys as part of his staff. Now, Eck, you can tell me whether, you know, the Flyers Mafia, meaning Holmgren and Bobby Clark and Bill Barber, if they're still involved, because if they're still involved, then there is experience there. But that's the kind
From
of.
what I understand, there's a big move to not have them be involved.
Okay,
and that's where they're going. They have been involved, but they will still probably still be involved, but they're not. I don't think they're going to have power.
My sense is that, I mean, and Eck is closer to it than I am, but my sense from, you know, just kind of a national perspective is that they've kind of moved away, you know, and you see that in all different places, like in Detroit. You know, Jim Devellano has been a powerful figure in Detroit for a lot of years, but, you know, at some point when you've been removed, like Jim hasn't been a GM in a long time, and he's still involved here in Detroit, but it's not the same as when Ken Holland was there as it is now with Steve Eisner. And Steve respects Jim for sure, but I mean, it's just over time it wanes.
No, it wanes. I mean, you still have guys like Dean Lombardi are here. You know, like he's in Philly.
Yeah.
You know, and that's a guy who actually had more GM experience than anybody in this organization. But you know,
I mean, really, Dan, the Briere situation is closer to the Adams situation in Buffalo more than it is Dubas, because I mean, Mike's right on. I mean, Dubas is right above him, and he's been
a full-fledged GM. Where I mean, there's no question that, you know, the thing I would say about both, you know, Jones and Briere, you know, to defend them, and it's you know, like experience-wise, you can't defend them, and they actually know that. You know, I've talked to both of them about that. But they are both incredibly hard workers who have a lot of who do have a lot of connections throughout hockey and have the right people. They're the kind of people who will, like Holmgren was, which I just always said I respected Holmgren, because if you asked him a question he didn't know, he would say, I don't know the answer, I'll find out for you. I think Briere and Jones are like that. You know, they have that.
But it does, like, and Kevin referenced Buffalo. Adams, for the first, I think, 3/4 of his first season as general manager, was flying solo. And then the organization realized that they needed somebody, an experienced hand, and they brought in Jason Karmanos, who he knew through Jason's dad, who was the owner of the Carolina Hurricanes, because at that point he was working with Carolina. And then so he knew him, he was familiar with him there. And now he's the assistant GM in Buffalo. And he actually tried to unsuccessfully to get the GM job in Pittsburgh. So, you know, I mean, but so there is a veteran support structure there in Buffalo that wasn't there initially. So maybe a couple months down the line, Briere, they bring in somebody like a Lawrence Gilman from Toronto. Like
I said, like Lombardi and Holmgren are both still here. Like that's and there's two GMs. Like, you know, there are two experienced guys.
But you don't. I don't know if you want that influence, Zach. That's the.
No, I think you do. I think what you need is not that influence, but you're okay having that mentorship around, and you're okay having that, like, you know, to go when you have a question, to go to them and ask them what they think, you know, like that kind of thing. That's the kind of stuff that I think you will see. And I think we'll see probably, you know, some pretty strong assistant GMs brought in too. Like, I think that'll also play into it, but I don't know quite who that's going to be yet.
I wanted to ask Jan, because I'm a little puzzled about, because we were talking earlier in the week about the Rangers coaching situation, and it started to sound like, you know, Laviolette was the inevitable choice. And then I know Russ was saying that maybe things were being stalled because the Rangers might have been waiting to hear about Sheldon Keefe's availability. And Treliving really didn't clarify that much, saying that he was going to talk to him and he liked Sheldon. And, you know, there's no guarantee he's going to stay or he's going to go at this point. How long can the Rangers hold out before they have to make a decision?
I mean, I think some of it might be determined as to which direction Columbus is going in, because they're rumored to be swimming in the same pool as to whether or not Laviolette is the guy, right? It's been, well, Spencer Carberry was one name that was mentioned. Obviously, he went to Washington. There was the Larry Brooks domino article, right, that for some reason, if Dubas went to Pittsburgh and decided to bring Keefe and Sullivan, for some reason wanted out of there, or they ended up wanting to get rid of him, that he could end up going to New York. And I wrote something on that yesterday because it made sense to a certain extent, because he knows the New York landscape, having coached there, had the connection with Drury because of the Team USA connection.
They want him badly in New York.
And clearly, yeah, and he would have been probably their top choice, but that kind of was kind of put to bed yesterday, given the comments that Dubas has made. His conversations and drivers as to quote unquote, taking part of the driver was to have Sullivan there as to why he took the job. Honestly, I don't know what direction they're going in now. I mean, I've written a couple times because look, depends on if they want to go the retread route or not, right? I'm on record where I don't particularly want Peter Laviolette. I don't. Right. He's not the guy necessarily that I want. I think some of the young guys have to step up. I know he's kind of molded some of the guys in the past. I don't think he's done a great job in some of the teams he's been on lately. I've been on record saying I'd like to see a guy like Jay Leach get a chance because what he's done in Seattle, and I think getting a younger hand there who's got some experience would be beneficial. I've also been on record saying I would have no problem if Chris Knobloch, who's been the coach in the AHL and has some experience being an assistant in the NHL for Florida, gets a shot. I know Russ and I disagree vehemently on this, but honestly, I wouldn't have a problem if Patrick Waugh got the job, right? I know. Wow. Now, again, granted, we all know what happened in Colorado, and that was a power play that he wanted that he lost, right? And we also know that, as Russ has said, in the QMJHL, he runs the show a lot, right? But he's got cups that he's won in the past as a player. He's got the connection to Drury, having played in Colorado before. He's got the personality to handle a major market if necessary. You would have to hope that he learned some lessons after leaving the NHL to go to the Q in terms of developing young players. There's some questions in terms of strategically what kind of defensive structure that he uses. Personality-wise, look, it could implode dramatically, but I got to be honest with you, if you think Peter Laviolette excites the fan base, do me a favor, go to Twitter for about 5 minutes, and granted, that shouldn't be the driver, but if they, as Brooks and others said, if they really wanted Laviolette, and he clearly was the guy, and they weren't waiting for other guys to be available, don't you think they would have hired him already? The fact that they've waited this long means they preferred other candidates to him that maybe have not become available, and to go just because he is the fallback option as the best of the retreads, to me, is not a reason to hire a guy.
And the issue with Laviolette that I find curious is that to me, he's similar to Gallant. Usually you go next. He is an attacking offensive guy. Obviously, he has evolved every place he goes. I'm sure he picks up some stuff. But the other thing that I'm really bothered by, Chris Drury knows everything about Peter Laviolette, and he certainly has some qualities to him. But, if you ask general managers who have dealt with him, he has been a very high maintenance guy for them in this regard. He doesn't like general managers being around his team. And I don't know a single general manager that doesn't like to be engaged.
Yeah.
And I sense that he was not David Poyle's most favorite coach ever. That's saying a lot because David Poyle is one of the nicest guys you're ever going to meet. And yet I don't think he loved his Peter Laviolette experience. Now, from Peter's perspective, he's gone. I know Eck made this point, and it's a valid one. He's been relatively successful everywhere he's been. Like, he's made the teams better. He's a good finisher. He can take a above average team and make it better. So, there's a lot to be said. But I didn't like this fit right from the beginning in New York. To me, it just seemed like the direction you should be heading. And if I was the Rangers, I'd be looking at a defensive guy, which is the vast majority of the league these days.
Yeah.
And get a guy to work on, because they've got the offense, but they really need to apply themselves defensively. So,
I don't think defense was the problem against the Devils at times, though. There was the inability for Gallant to make any adjustments during the series. Granted, Artemi Panarin had a horrible series. Zibanejad got caught up in kind of the structure against playing against Hischier. I know John Hines has been mentioned, who's another guy that I got to be honest with you. You think Laviolette doesn't excite the fan base? Go take a look at a couple of comments on John Hines. And
we're talking about a Devils and an Islanders ex-coach too, but you're both in Laviolette and Islanders.
I think Hines is a really good coach. I just think he suffers from, people just don't know about him. But those who do know him well, like him. To be honest, that's why I was surprised that Trotz did what he did to Hines. I thought I saw Frank Cervelli called his departure clunky, and I thought that's the perfect word for it. It was clunky. And he said at the conference that he kept Hines in the loop. Well, so what? Like, that's not, you kind of let him hang there. And they said before, if he found somebody like better, well, was pretty clear he was conducting a search.
Sure.
You know, so anyway, it just seemed disingenuous. And
I don't agree with that. I honestly thought that it made sense the way he did it. And listening to him describe it, I was kind of like, I don't know. To me, I was kind of appeased with what Trotz said.
Yeah, I was not. I'm a big, as everyone knows, as Tom Ladle used to call him, my long lost uncle. I really like Barry Trotz. I've known him well for a long time, and I was disappointed in how he handled that. And
it's not going over well in the coaching fraternity.
No, sure. I know. I've talked. It's not going well among general managers.
It's not. But he also didn't. Did he have a real choice in this matter? Like, that's a question.
I guess Kevin, the better question is how could he have better handled it? I guess is the question.
He should have fired him.
Should have fired him the day after.
Fired him right from the beginning.
But what would have happened if he conducted his search and didn't find anybody?
But he did. But it's pretty clear that that's not what he was doing.
Or was the goal just to find somebody because he just didn't like him at all?
So he was in competition with all the coaches he was talking to. Like Brunette had other places.
That's my problem. I don't believe that.
And it was the problem.
You don't think Brunette had other places?
If it was the problem that Nashville stayed competitive, even though they traded off players till the very end of the season, then that's a case to not fire him. But if it was up to Barry Trotz and he said, "I'm going to fire the guy," then put him out of his misery and fire him on April 15th.
That would have been the fair thing to do.
I think, and I heard a little bit of this, but I'm not guaranteeing that this is correct. But it sounded like his first choice was the guy who went to Washington.
Carver.
Yeah, that's really what Trotz really wanted. That didn't work out. The feeling was Brunette was probably going to get hired someplace else, maybe even New York, and then then Nashville talked to Brunette and got him, and Nashville went all in. Like the Brunette interview, whatever I heard, it was like they liked him so much that there's like this. They didn't want to risk losing him as well.
Yeah, well, the worst place to be if you're going to the prom is to be the third disaster backup, and that's what it sounded like John Hines was. It's like, okay, if we can't hire Carberry and we can't hire Brunette, then we'll keep you. Well, no, that sucks. I mean, that's not what
he basically just said, "I'm going to look around, and if there's someone I like better, but otherwise you'll be fine." I don't think that's really what he did. I think he had in his head, "I'm likely going to fire him here. I'm going to look around." So I don't know why he hung him out, because I think he intended to fire him.
Now, Jan, I'll just say this: if Patrick Roy, who's in the finals for the Memorial Cup, if Quebec beats, I think it's Seattle that they're playing, if they win, that'll be 2 Memorial Cups for him. And he did have a lot of success in one year, even though there was
first year.
Yeah, in that first year. I mean, my concern about Roy is not the coach. It's the personality and New York. It's like, remember Michel Bergeron, who had that, Le Petit Tigre personality. He did not fit in New York at all. And that's, I think, yeah.
You also had Esposito there as a GM, as opposed to Drury, who at least has the relationship with Roy coming into the role. Now, Grant, look, I'm not saying it's a perfect fit by any stretch of the imagination. You have to deal with Dolan and Sather, who were clearly heavily involved and probably more involved than they should be. Look, the question being is, if you weren't going to hire somebody better, why did you let go Gallant? Although a lot of it may have been due to the post-season news meetings that they had with the players. May have been a driver, right? A couple of years ago, if you remember correctly, Alain Vigneault was let go similarly because of similar issues associated with it. As Kevin said, if you're hiring guys like Laviolette and Hines, is that necessarily a step up from what you already had with Gallant, or you had no choice but to make a change? And if you're going to make a change, then make a change that makes sense, as opposed to just going down the same road again, but a slightly nuanced difference.
Well, here's what I think happens in this situation. Like if you're doing like if you're trying to do like a scientific chemical reaction on something, right? You can only change one thing at a time, or else you don't know what really is causing anything, right? Like, so I think the reality here is, the players, they've done all these changes with, right? So I think that they want by bringing in a coach that they at least understand. Like if they bring in a coach that they don't understand, how is that going to? How will they know what's going wrong? Kind of in a way, I don't know if that makes any sense to anybody else. But it's like there's a certain, like if they bring in a coach like Laviolette, then you get to put the players on notice, and you get to see what the players are really all about. Which also we do have to bring up for a second, the Patrick Kane thing. So
I was gonna mention that.
Yes, Patrick Kane is out 4 to 6 months, right? So that is obviously going to affect.
Well, okay, Kev, I have a little side bet with Russ, because I think there will be a team out there that will sign Patrick Kane before the season and not wait the 4 to 6 months until he's healthy, and then him basically like doing a Matt Sundin and halfway through the year trying to sign with somebody. I think he'll sign with a team and he'll recover, and then he'll come back with that team. He may not be able to get big money, and he may not be able to get more than 1 year, but if he wants to play that this year, I think that's what he's going to have to do. What is your feel on what Kane?
I think if he really does want a 3-year contract, which is the rumor, then he's going to have to wait till mid-season and everybody to see where he's at after the rehabilitation. But, if you're a team and you think you don't have an unbelievable shot to get him, and he's willing to sign with you now, you might consider that. But I mean,
well, so Nicholas Backstrom last year had a similar surgery, right? He had the surgery June 18th. He was back playing with Washington January 7th, right? So that's about a 6-month window. Right. What that does mean, even if it's prorated, right, you're not getting the Nikita Kucherov benefit where you can stash him on LTIR all year and then bring him back off LTIR just in time for the playoffs where the cap doesn't matter. So you're going to need to have enough cap space, even prorated, depending on the contract, to fit him in by mid-season and have 3 months of the cap hit. So that's a material factor when it comes depending on what kind of contract he signs.
And anybody who watched Backstrom, and I did.
Oh, he was not great.
Not great until probably March. And then he started to play better. He started to play closer to the Backstrom that we know. But that's why, that's my argument in terms of, now I'm sure Kane wants security and he wants as many years as he can get his hands on. But NHL teams are going to say, okay, we want to see, give us a 1-year prove it deal, and then we'll sign you. Now, he's Patrick Kane. He can probably get anything he wants, Kev, because he's won 3 Stanley Cups and he's a Hall of Famer. But when you're coming off that kind of surgery, people are going to be a little hesitant.
And given what we saw from him also this year, right, he also struggled substantially. I mean, everybody knew he was playing through an injury, right? It all depends. It all depended on how material that injury was and how much was going to impact him. And look, he had the game 2 against the Devils, but other than that, he really didn't have a particularly strong finish, which I think most of us expected when he was acquired. And the only reason he ended up in New York is honestly, the price tag was less than probably most people expected. And he kind of forced his way to a trade to New York because he told Chicago the only place he would go is New York.
Right.
I mean, he really wants to sign long-term is New York, apparently.
Yeah, but so here's the problem, right? So look, I love Kane. It's kind of hard not to. But given what we saw last year, given the need for Lafreniere and Kakko to both get bigger roles, given the cap implications that exist with signing Kane to begin with, given the need to sign Lafreniere, given the need to sign Keandre Miller, given the other cap impacts that they have, and the need to have a more balanced lineup, signing Kane doesn't necessarily provide any of that. And that's part of the problem, right? If he's healthy and he can score, great, but he doesn't make up for some of the deficiencies that are created by signing him.
What's the number, Jan? $3 million?
Maybe.
I
hate saying maybe only because, like I said, they have $11 million right now in cap room. They need a backup goalie. They need to re-sign Lafreniere. They need to re-sign Keandre Miller. And I think Kakko, they have 1 more year. So they're going to be up against the cap pretty significantly to balance out the rest of the lineup, which is why Barclay Goodrow's name continues to be mentioned a lot. Look, I'm one who doesn't think I don't think. Wait, hold on. If you want to see a contract where a guy is materially overplayed, do me a favor. Go look at Blake Coleman's contract and shut up about Barclay Goodrow already. Goodrow at $3.6 million is overpaid, but he's not like $6 million overpaid.
No. I mean, I think he's a good third line player, and $3.6 million on a team that's not cap strapped is not a bad AAV. But the problem is they need flexibility, and they really can't afford to have that kind of.
They would be able to trade him in a second for that contract.
But 4 years. 4 years.
Do you think so, Kevin? Do you think for that contract?
Yeah, and again, I bring this up all the time, but we're approaching $3 million on an average salary, and when as the GMs have explained to me, that really in their mind, the average salary is almost $5 million because, everybody factors in that they're going to have 7 or 8 guys making $1 million or less, which then, then they've got to sign 15 guys and they've got like $74 million left, which is, almost, $5 million per player. So
I mean, I guess the question I'll ask is if the Rangers had not signed Goodrow to the $21.6 million deal after trading a 7th rounder for him, would he have gotten a similar contract on the open market in free agency that
Probably.
year? No, but I don't think there's any question, right?
Yeah.
Same Chris Kreider when he signed also, right? And they kind of signed him.
Oh, yeah,
None of us expected a pandemic. None of us expected a flat cap for the most part. If the cap had risen even 2 to 3 million the last couple of years, nobody would be saying boo about any of these contracts right now.
And you're talking about the primary reason why Kyle Dubas lost his job in Toronto, because they expected the cap to grow and they didn't expect the $40 million on 4 players to be 50% of their salary. And now what you're just talking about with Barclay Goodrow is what Toronto is going to be talking about over the next couple months, because it's not that any of those 4 players are bad players. They're all good players. The problem is they need flexibility to address the areas of need that have been shortcomings of them competing in the playoffs, like defense, like a number 1 or a number 2 defenseman, and goaltending. And you can't afford to pay $40 million on 4 players who play the same type of game and at some points of the year don't show up.
Right. I mean, you're going to have the same problem. Look, they have Ryan Lindgren coming up as a free agent after next year, restricted free agent. They got to have his contract to worry about. You can argue, the Panarin contract, nobody expected it, and they ended up getting him, and that accelerated the rebuild for better or for worse, depending on your view, given what you've seen in the playoffs. And you can argue also that Trouba is somewhat overpaid, but given what he had on his last contract in Winnipeg for the year that was expiring, the number he got was probably somewhat close to in line what you thought he'd get. I think he's still probably at least $1 million overpaid based upon what the contract would have been. But, you start adding up $500,000 here, $750 here, $1 million here. Now you're looking at about $4, $5, $6 million in cap hit that if you would have had a normal run in terms of the cap rising would not have been a concern because you would have had that room. Now, as you mentioned with Toronto also, you have 4 guys making a ton of money where you were expecting the cap to be somewhere closer to 90 by now than the $83 million that we're likely going to have on a cap this year.
No, it's all true. It's all. And a lot of teams are in that same boat. Like there's a lot of contracts that are in the same situation especially contracts that were signed before the pandemic, when everybody expected normal rise of salary cap. So everything now is completely. But I mean, Gaudreau is the kind of guy who can play up and down the lineup, and for $3.5 million or whatever, that's a player that teams will jump on. Like they will jump.
So you want to argue the biggest mistake the Rangers made was letting Jesper Fast go, because the rumor was he wanted a 6-year deal. He was making $1.85 million a year on his contract that expired. He got 3 years, $6 million from Carolina. Rangers would have gone 3.8, 3.9. You would have had a similar impact to Goodrow, a guy who can move up the ladder, who played with Artemi Panarin, and you probably would have saved $1 million or $1 to $2 million a year. But he ended up going to Carolina and was a perfect fit in that roster at times, and now he's going to be a free agent. Yeah. So, as you talked about, right, every single contract has an impact based upon who you grab and who you don't grab. And then, look, Toronto's got the same issues. Look, you would have figured this year was going to be the year they did it. Boston, we don't know what's going to be. Look, if Bergeron and Krejci don't come back, who the heck is their number 1 center right now? When both of those guys took massive discounts to stay with Boston. What's going to happen other than them probably re-signing Tyler Bertuzzi?
Is there any chance Bertuzzi could return to Detroit, Kevin?
No. They never really even got going on contract negotiations just because Steve and he just have had so much tension.
Right. That's what I figured.
Yeah. Steve even admitted that he said they really didn't even talk after the start of the season. So,
how high do you think he'll be? I think he might price himself out of Boston.
Well, I just wrote that. Yeah. And basically we got that from Boston Hockey Now. The problem is they have $5 million left and they have 15 players signed. And if Bergeron and Krejci are coming back, I think Bergeron's coming back for sure, but that's just a guess. So they got to pay them, and they got to get Trent Frederick. signed, and they've got to get Swayman signed.
Well, I will say the two most favorite words in the summer: offer sheet, because there you go with Jeremy Swayman. You got a young goaltender. I mean, that it's set up for you. Go do it.
Can we take a bet on that one too, Mike? You got the side bet with Russ on the other one. Can we take a side bet on this one right now?
They're signing Swayman. So
I know. I'm just kidding.
Yeah.
Especially after what happened in the playoffs. Like the playoffs didn't.
I just robbed Eck of like 3 columns in July.
I am not that.
No, you haven't. He'll still post them.
I write less offer sheets than other people do. All right, but that's but I was definitely maybe one who started writing offer sheets, but now everybody else writes. So I'm less do that. Anyway,
one thing I did want to bring up, because Mike always brings up about 4 players, $40 million, but
I know.
The Florida Panthers have 4 players at 38.5, so they're only $1.5 million different. Like, why is that?
Because those 4 players, one named Bobrovsky, one named Kachuk,
but that
showed up in the playoffs. That's what I'm saying.
It's not the money; it's the guys.
It's the performance. It's like, okay, Austin Matthews scored.
Do you believe in your heart that those 4 guys are incapable of?
Not incapable. I just don't think it's the right mix, Kev. I think you've got too much of one type of talent and not enough of another type of talent.
Yeah, I agree with you on the mix in terms of defense, and you got to have one of those guys. But I don't know. I think you put too much emphasis on the money, and I also believe that it's possible that eventually that group would come together. I mean, you just have to the fact that Dubas never really solved the goaltending or the defense, to me, was a much bigger problem than how much
the 2 biggest issues that he's going to have in Pittsburgh, by the way, right? Like, that's what he's going to Pittsburgh with goaltending and defense, right? So that's
you're absolutely right, and the goaltending situation is very similar.
It is.
And he basically said the same thing about Tristan Jarry, about getting to know him.
Right. It sounds like Brian Camp.
One thing that's interesting is that Mike Sullivan loves Jarry.
Yes.
So he speaks about highly of him. The one difference though is Pittsburgh has the impact defenseman. I mean, Letang can still play.
Mm-hmm.
Still moves that puck. Still one of the better transition guys. So that's the difference.
Logan Riley's an impact defenseman, though, don't you think? I mean, I think.
I love him. I think he does a good job. He's almost like maybe he's a 1B.
Morgan Riley is an extremely good 2. He's an average 1, and that's
he's not Letang. He's
not Letang. That's well said, Jan. Jan's right.
Hall of Famer.
He's not Letang. I mean, again, look. I mean, Pittsburgh needs also other guys besides Letang, which was unfortunately when he was out, right? They also are an aging roster to a certain extent. I mean, look, with Malkin and Crosby, and they took another kick at the can to try to make a run. And they might have beaten the Rangers the year before if Jarry had been fully healthy going into the playoffs. I mean, he didn't come back until the end of that series. They almost pulled out with Louis Domingue playing goal for them.
If you need Exhibit A and Exhibit B, Kev, of why Ron Hextall got fired, Jeff Petrie was a failure in Pittsburgh, and so was the John Marino for Ty Smith deal.
Good, that was brutal.
I'm going to run out of power, so I want to make one more point about Pittsburgh. I was on Pittsburgh radio today, and what I said about that, I really like the Dubas fit there because he has a lot of experience in dealing with teams that are on the verge. Now, you can argue that, he didn't push all the right buttons and get it done. On the other hand, he's used to those problems. Like, he's not going to it's not going to overwhelm him. He can deal with that. But the one thing that I said, which got me in trouble with the people who were listening because they weren't really following my logic, and then when I explained it, like the host said, I think you finally went over the people, but he's got a little bit of Hextall in him in this regard. Like, he certainly respects the importance of refreshing the team with the draft. Like, he hung on to, now I'm drawing a complete blank, the college kid.
Matthew Nice.
Matthew Nice. And just because, he could have traded him to get more help, But he didn't. He hung on to him because, he's the future and all that. And I think they need that in Pittsburgh. They need a guy who is going to sell out and be all in, but pay just enough attention to try to stash away some nuts for winters up the road.
Kyle
Yeah,
Dubas
that's
was,
really interesting. I mean, Hextall was Team Jari. Hextall liked Tristan Jari. Like
Kyle
that.
Dubas was sorry, go.
Yeah, I really do. I really did hear that.
Kyle Dubas was GM in Toronto for 5 years. He traded his first round pick every year.
No, I'm well aware of that, but I'm just saying
he got some back,
right?
And that was so.
I think he at least respects the idea.
Oh, I agree.
That like let's put it this way: the Panthers could win it all this year, but Zito's got nothing coming for the next few years. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I mean that's the difference. That's my only point.
Yeah, you're right, 100% right. That's all the time we have for today, guys. Anyway, let's get out of here. Remember, folks, without the buzz, it's just hockey. Jans, thank you so much for stopping by. As always, great to get your perspective. And Kevin, enjoy the weekend, guys. Enjoy the next time we talk to you guys. It'll be game 1. We'll be over. Game 2 will be on its way.